Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the 16th lecture of Rest in Belief. In our previous lecture 15, we confirmed that the books of James and Hebrews are not books meant to frighten us living in the age of grace, but are survival guidelines for the Jewish saints who must break through and pass the 7-year tribulation. Today in lecture 16, we move on to the second part of that tribulation survival manual. We will discover through the biblical text itself why the Gospel of John, which many firmly believe to be a gospel of grace, is strictly a Jewish tribulation gospel, and why 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st John, and Jude are blood-stained combat manuals that will be placed into the hands of the saints, thrown into the very center of the Great Tribulation. First, let us begin with the Gospel of John, which establishes the terrifying laws of this tribulation. The mainstream church cites John 3:16 to claim that this book is a gospel of unconditional grace for the Gentiles. But look at the true purpose of writing this book, recorded in John 20:31. But these are written that ye might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. This book is absolutely not trying to teach our Gentile saints, born after the cross, how to become a church by grace. The sole purpose of this book is to make the Jewish nation believe that Jesus is the Christ, the lawful King of the Jews, endlessly prophesied in the Old Testament. Therefore, if you read the text of the Gospel of John through the standard of the age of grace, you will fall into a horrific doctrinal contradiction. Look carefully at the famous parable of the vine in John chapter 15. The mainstream church packages this as a sentimental lesson, saying, let's stay well attached to Jesus and bear beautiful fruits of the Spirit. But read the text to the end. Every branch in me that beareth not fruit he taketh away. If a man abide not in me, he is cast forth as a branch, and is withered, and men gather them and cast them into the fire, and they are burned. How can this be the doctrine of the Grace Church? The Apostle Paul recorded in Ephesians that our pure Gentile church is the physical body itself, connected to the bone and flesh of Jesus Christ. Everyone, just because the limbs attached to a person's body don't work well and fail to bear fruit, does the master take a knife, cut off those limbs, and burn them? It is permanently impossible for a member to be severed from the physical body of Jesus and cast into hellfire due to a lack of works. We are a body of grace perfectly sealed by the Holy Spirit. Then who on earth are these branches that are mercilessly cut off and burned because they fail to bear fruit even while attached to Jesus? They are the Jewish tribulation saints who will be left under the beast system of the Great Tribulation. Tribulation faith does not end with merely agreeing in the heart as it does now. Even before the blade of the Antichrist, they must bear the fruit of physical works by risking their lives to reject the mark of the beast and enduring to the end. If they compromise and receive the mark or fail to bear fruit, they are immediately severed from the branch and cast into the burning hell of fire and brimstone. John 15 is speaking of this conditional survival law of the tribulation period. To show how urgent and terrifying this conditional survival law is, Jesus warns through a unique speaking style. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus says the word verily only once when speaking important words. But why is it that only in the Gospel of John, the exact same word pours out overlapping twice as verily, verily? Remember that not one jot or one tittle of the biblical text ever falls to the ground. This is absolutely not a coincidental speaking style or simple emphasis. Look at the terrifying prophetic law of double repetition in the Bible. In Genesis 41:32, Joseph proclaims this before the coming great famine, which is a type of the Great Tribulation. And for that the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. That is right. The verily, verily of John is a terrifying prophetic alarm directed at the stubborn Jewish nation who will reject the age of grace and willfully walk into the furnace of the Great Tribulation on their own 2 feet, declaring that this time of Jacob's trouble has been finally judicially established by God and will shortly come to pass. To the Jews who rejected grace, it was a message of love spoken with tears before them. This is your last and only law and chance to survive in the Great Tribulation. The warning of the tribulation that Jesus established like this in the Gospel of John now unfolds into a full-scale, practical escape manual as we move to the epistles of Peter. Let's dissect the timeline. 1 Peter 1:1 calls the recipients the strangers scattered throughout. These are not the Gentile church, but the Jews of the tribulation period who have fled into the wilderness to escape the persecution of the Antichrist. If mainstream theology tries to deny this, look at the wedge driven in 1 Peter 2:9. But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, and holy nation. This exactly quotes the national covenant God gave exclusively to Israel in Exodus 19:6. The church of the age of grace is never a national nation, and in the Bible, without a single exception, Gentiles are recorded as nations, a plural, and the Jews as a nation, singular. Then who is this holy nation? Naturally, it is the Jews. Therefore, 1 Peter is a strict physical escape manual for the Jewish nation that must flee the external persecution of the Antichrist during the first 3.5 years, the first half of the 7-year tribulation. However, the moment the physical escape of the first 3.5 years ends and we enter 2 Peter, the timeline is thrown into the climax of the latter 3.5 years, where the Antichrist completely seizes the entire world. This goes beyond external persecution. It is the scene of the great spiritual apostasy where false prophets rise from within the Jews and collude with the image of the beast. That is why 2 Peter 2:20 pronounces a terrifying loss of salvation that can absolutely never happen in our age of grace. For if after they have escaped the pollutions of the world, through the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they are again entangled therein and overcome, the latter end is worse with them than the beginning. A once saved saint of the age of grace can never have his salvation canceled and go to hell. But on the earth under the beast system of the latter 3.5 years, it is different. Even a Jew who acknowledged Jesus as the Messiah will have his salvation permanently canceled if he cannot endure the persecution, is again entangled by the Antichrist, and commits the apostasy of receiving the mark of the beast. 2 Peter is depicting this blood-splattering spiritual warfare. In the book that describes the survival state of those who did not receive the mark and survived to the end through this horrific tribulation of the first and latter 3.5 years is 1 John. The mainstream church lightly lumps together the verse in 1 John 2:18. Even now are there many antichrists, interpreting it as a spiritual symbol or merely heretical cult leaders appearing around us. However, a verse proving that this book does not deal with the doctrine of the peaceful age of grace appears in 1 John 3:9. Whosoever is born of God doth not commit sin, for his seed remaineth in him, and he cannot sin. Pastors of the mainstream church break into a cold sweat before this verse. This is because among us Gentile saints living in the age of grace, there is not a single person who never commits a sin from the moment of salvation until death. So they bring up Greek grammar and invent words not even in the original text, saying this means not sinning habitually, forcefully altering the Bible. But the original text has no compromise. It is not declaring that one sins a little less, but declaring perfect sinlessness. Cannot sin. Then what is this sin, and who on earth are these people? The answer is clearly recorded in the same book, 1 John 5:16. Yet there is a sin unto death. In the tribulation period, there exists a specific sin unto death, which if committed once can never be repented of, sending one straight to eternal death. It is the very act of worshiping the Antichrist and receiving the mark of the beast on the right hand or forehead. 1 John 3:9 is a proclamation directed at the Jewish remnant who kept their faith through works in the very center of this tribulation period. They are those perfectly protected by God so that they can never commit the sin unto death of receiving the mark. 1 John is not a book discussing the petty moral sins we commit in daily life. It is a terrifying tribulation doctrine exposing the physical combat reality of the Jewish tribulation saints who must reject the mark of the beast, risking the survival of their souls and bodies on the earth during the latter 3.5 years. And at the very tail end of this long and horrific tribulation, the final Advent judgment that permanently destroys the beast system is recorded in the book of Jude. Jude 1:14-15 quotes the prophecy of Enoch and proclaims, "Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment upon all." This is not the rapture to rescue the wife, the Samaritan church, into the air. It is the physical judgment descending directly to the earth to end the Battle of Armageddon. It is a merciless death sentence against those who betrayed the truth and stood on the side of the beast. With this terrifying judgment of the earthly descent, the Antichrist system is completely shattered, and the remnant of Israel will enter the millennial kingdom in the flesh. The entire prophetic timeline of the 7-year tribulation concludes majestically in the book of Jude. Now connect the trajectory of these epistles we have traced so far once again. Starting from the conditional vine parable of John to the holy nation of 1 Peter, the irreversible loss of salvation in 2 Peter, the perfect sinlessness of 1 John, and finally the earthly descent judgment of Jude. All these texts, which the mainstream church fell into numerous doctrinal contradictions, trying to force mix with the gospel of grace, have now found their perfect rightful place upon the exact timeline of the Jewish church passing through the Great Tribulation. With this part 1, the doctrine of the Jewish church and the framework of the 7-year tribulation is fully complete. Now we return to the pause history of Acts, the point in Acts 13 where the stage shifted to the Gentile world of Antioch. Starting from the next lecture, Lecture 17, we will earnestly dissect Part 2, the doctrine of the Samaritan Transitional Church, where law and grace were abnormally combined and boiling over. Do not miss the next lecture that will expose the fierce doctrinal collisions of Samaria, governed by the absolute law of to the Jew first. Until now, this has been Rest in Belief. Thank you.